friends. Welcome to Sky House Herbs podcast. I'm Ashley Ellenvoss, a clinical herbalist, and in this space, I share my knowledge and experience with plant medicine to help you on your own journey of healing and transformation. Join me in exploring the ancient wisdom of plant spirit medicine and how it can be used to heal the body, mind, and spirit. We'll talk to experts in the field and share stories from people who've been transformed by powerful plant allies. New episodes are released each Monday, so please subscribe. And now, let's explore this mystical world of plant medicine together. Hi, good to be back.
Yeah, I'm so happy to have you here. And I feel like, I've had some powerful Uranus transits. I'm a Taurus rising, so it's entered my first house, and I've had some big ones and I'll certainly speak to those too. But Uranus over, you're a new moon, double Taurus, sun and moon, and you got the conjunction from Uranus. And I feel like it's been one of the bigger experiences probably of your life so far. And yeah. I think you're going to have, I just know in the way that you've talked about those experiences between the two of us, that you would be someone that people would find, I think, really uplifting to hear from, and maybe helping people sort of ease some of their anxiety about the planet.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I definitely think, that, and it's been nice being married to an astrologer, because as things were unraveling and falling apart and being rebuilt, you'd be like, well, your Uranus is going over your sun and moon again. I'd be like, So, it's nice to have kind of a cheerleader there through it to help you kind of, understand what's happening. So I'm happy to be here and share my experience, and hopefully it will be a support to others who might be about to experience or who've gone through something similar.
Yeah, totally. I would also like to mention that it is in the midst of a Venus square to Uranus. You can see, where is she? She's over there. That's a Uranus decision. that rescue dog that we took home recently was a very unexpected Venus-Uranus dynamic that was in the sky. So I thought that was funny. Just the Venus retrograde in my fourth house brought a massive lion dog into our house.
Totally.
So anyway, all you need to know is that she looks like a big, huge watchdog, and she is like nothing but a giant cuddly moose. So anyway, well, let's start by talking about what people fear that Uranus will do. And I want to qualify this. Most people who take in astrology content aren't walking around being like, in fear all the time. But I will tell you that as an astrologer who's been doing this for 13 years, when Uranus transits come around, I myself will fall into these still after 13 years. So I can't just assume that everyone out there is, like, we all probably have the same traps that we fall into. You get to know the planet, you have a few difficult experiences, and all of a sudden, anytime that planet comes up in transit, you start gritting, baring your teeth, and you get white knuckled, and you're like, oh shit,
Right.
And so I think we all do this. I think it's very human. And I think that if we don't know how to recognize when we're doing it or that we're doing it, and counter it with a constructive narrative, that we will get burnt out, and astrology can actually be a source of like underlying stress. I mean, there's a big difference between watching the news to be informed about what's happening in the world, for example, and keeping up with the headlines just to kind of know what's happening because you're a concerned citizen, you're a political animal. But there's another way in which you can get stuck on the news cycle and dread and like addicted, and like the fear response is actually a big part of how things are sold to us nowadays.
Yeah.
And the same is true for astrology content. I'm not going to say, look at, some of the titles that I find myself using at times to try to welcome new people in will be taken from what I see working. For example, this month we've got a big new moon or something. And it's like you're trying to grab people's excitement in the way you title a talk, but you're also aware of the fact that if you do that too often, and with any kind of anxiety-provoking language, you're really contributing. As astrologers, we're contributing to a culture of burnout and fatigue eventually.
Totally, totally. Because then we're always on our toes. Like, what's the next big thing that's going to screw up my life? And
Yeah.
that's no way to live. you know?
No, right.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's so I think that these are the things that we fear that Uranus will do. Number one, it will tower card our asses. And
totally.
so people associate Uranus very frequently with the tower card in tarot. And again, I've said this in every part of the series so far. These associations are there for a reason. They're not just totally fictitious. They're not just being made up by, ignorant people who have no idea what they're talking about or just living in fear. No, because Uranus sometimes shows up and feels like the tower card in tarot looks, we start making that association over and over again. But the point I've made at every point in this series has been that we have to wrestle with, like I told in the last episode on Neptune, I told the story of Jacob, how Jacob met a stranger on the road at night. This is an Old Testament story from the Bible. He met a stranger on the road at night that he started wrestling with. And I'm imagining them doing like jujitsu all night, like rolling around trying to pin the other one down. And he wanted to know who this mysterious figure, this shadowy figure in the dark was, right? And there's this poem that was written called Wrestling Jacob, and he says, "I won't let you go until you tell me your name." And that's part of the story in the Bible. Well, in the morning comes, he finally, although the angel breaks his hip, he realizes that it's an angel, that you've been wrestling with an angel. And what I'm trying to say in this series is not that the things that we're afraid of aren't part of our experience any more than Jacob didn't have to wrestle with a dark figure on the road that he didn't know the nature of, but that an astrological lifestyle and astrology as a spiritual practice over time means that we wrestle and engage with questions. We wrestle and engage with difficult experiences and patterns. And we call them, through astrology, we call them archetypes or planets or gods. But that if you keep going, what I've noticed is that my elders in astrology, and even myself after years, I very rarely describe Uranus anymore in terms of the scariest, most provocative, shocking, like adjectives, because over time you've seen glimpses of the angel you're wrestling with, and that's really what happens if we stick with it and we seek understanding and we seek to grow and learn. Then suddenly we realize that the most difficult ways that we have of describing the transits were really the ways that we had of describing them prior to our understanding emerging. And that's a totally normal process that everyone has to go through. And I will say that, and I'm sure Ashley would say the same thing, a Uranus transit could come tomorrow that could knock me back into a space where I couldn't see what was going on. And I was bewildered and overwhelmed and frustrated and in the same space of fear and reactivity. I'm not at all saying that I've reached a place where the planets or experience itself couldn't do that to me,
Mm-hmm.
but we
Yeah.
seek this understanding.
Yeah. And I think too, it's like, and almost, I feel like in this lifestyle, I like that way of phrasing it, is that you kind of look forward to it. There's almost like this exciting anticipate, like you anticipate because you've seen what they've done before and you're like, like I know this shot is going to be good for me,
Right.
but it doesn't feel like it in the moment, or it might not, start off that way. But eventually the toppling of the tower means that I get to rebuild it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's use the medicinal. You're an herbalist, so let's use another pick image, right? Because a lot of people probably get scared of shots. Let's say, some medicines that are really good for you taste pretty bitter.
Oh yeah. Yeah. That's
You
so
know,
true. Yeah. And so, you might be looking at, and I guess even another metaphor that might even be better is the illness itself. It's like, how many times have you been ready for some event or party or something, and then you get sick and you can't go? And you're like, oh, this is the worst thing. I can't go to this thing I really wanted. But then the illness becomes the teacher, because as you're resting, like you get all these downloads, you start
right.
making deep changes, you start recalculating your trajectory, and all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you're like, I'm glad I didn't go to that party, I'm glad that I got to stay home and like kind of reorient myself. And I feel
That's
like
right.
that's kind of what they do for us.
Yeah, there's this. I mean, just the general thing to say is that, does it feel like the tower card sometimes? Yes, but that's not the way that I think about Uranus now after so many experiences, after hearing so many stories. And I resist, or I'm very careful to not think about Uranus that way, because it's sort of like I can't describe the angel anymore in terms of a dark, ominous stranger I'm wrestling with.
Mhm.
You know, that doesn't mean that angel couldn't knock my ass over, you know, because it's a divine energy, and I'm just a little dude, you know. So but you get the point. So tower card harasses, it'll tear your life apart, it'll knock everything down, because it's just here to destroy things. And number two is that Uranus transits will come along and shock and traumatize you with unexpected difficulties. Now, people may not say, if someone were like, tell me about Uranus, all of the enlightened bodhisattvas watching this channel right now would be like, well, let me say that Uranus brings the unexpected, and it can be very challenging, but it's really good for you. It helps you break through. Yeah, right. We would all say that. But in your head, when you think of Uranus transits, there are moments where you're like, shit, this thing's going to
Yeah.
knock me on my ass, and it's going to come from left field like a
Yeah.
sucker punch from a moose dog jumping up on me unexpectedly, which has been happening to me lately. So, you know, but that's what that is what we sometimes subtly, that's the anxiety that creeps in, is that we can have the script running about, well, this is the positive version of Uranus, but you still think to yourself, Uranus is like a 98-mile-an-hour fastball that's going to clock me on the hip, you know, and not for any reason other than it just likes to be very shocking, you know. Number three is that it somehow, some way will just destabilize me mentally, emotionally, or physically. This planet will come along and it just threatens stability. And so when you, how is that something to be excited about? You know what I mean? How is that? I mean,
Yeah.
that's anxiety provoking right away.
And especially if you've had like mental health issues or challenges, like if you've really worked hard on trying to like, stabilize yourself. I know for me, like definitely when Uranus has come around, I'm like, I have been working so hard like
Yeah.
on my stuff, and like I feel like I finally got it put together in a way that I can manage. And yeah. And then the biggest fear though is that all of that work I've done is going to be taken away and I'm going to be off to the loony bin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I remember like the Uranus transit we're going to mention in a little bit here happened right around the time of the birth of our second daughter, Summer. And I mean, there were a few days during the midst of that Uranus transit where a lot of things were happening. And I remember you would be like, you're like, not that I'm actually going to do this, but right now I feel like I could just like run deep into the woods and never come back. It was like, or you'd be like, I just need to drive really fast and like scream out my window.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's that
But
you reach that, you find those edges, I think, when you're in the midst of it.
yeah.
Yeah, the fantasy, the shocking fantasies can kind of go a little bit wild.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, here is what I think Uranus actually does. Now, this is, again, we're not really saying that any of these descriptions are off. We're only saying that it's sort of like we tend to describe these things insofar as we're projecting our own unconscious material onto Uranus. The more you experience Uranus, although you might get a chuckle out of these descriptions, the more that it feels almost like you might be offending a friend whose name you now know, because you wrestled with a divine force in your own soul and your own unconscious, and it's become a treasure. And that's what we're going for. It's not fluff, it's really not, because you got to live through sometimes these difficult ways of seeing an archetype before you can appreciate it in a sort of robust way. But what Uranus actually does. Now, I'm going to ask Ashley to talk about, she had two different Uranus transits, and I'm going to ask her to talk about them in relation to these themes. So I'll mention the theme, and then we'll have Ashley fill in the blanks. The first one is what Uranus actually does. And again, consistently, students, clients, myself, my friends, colleagues, this is how we describe Uranus when we start to see what it's doing for the soul. The first thing is that Uranus illuminates things that we have not been able to see. and it illuminates them with such dazzling brilliance that it's like you can't help, for most of the time, people can't help but take a pretty big step forward in their individual growth. We might broadly call that individuation. I am becoming more of what I am because I can see more clearly more of the truth of who I am or what I've been or what is going on. But it is like, you know, rather than thinking of it like a tower card blasting a structure, I like to think about it like a lightning bolt that has sudden illuminating power. And there is a suddenness to the way in which that illumination can happen through events and circumstances. But in hindsight, you'll almost always describe a Uranus transit as having greatly illuminated some dimension of your life that was relatively unconscious, sometimes with striking sudden brilliance. But then connected closely to it is the feeling that I then took a big step forward. Now, that step forward is relative. I'm not saying there's some kind of ladder that you're trying to get to level 10 on. It's just a way that we have of describing it. I took a step forward as a person. I grew. I had to make tough choices, but I feel like, I had to become something different or something new in the way that things were suddenly illuminated. So, on that note, you had Uranus on your sun and moon between like 2018 and 2020. You also had it when we first met and opened Sky House together. Maybe you could reflect on what those experiences were like for you and how you looked at them then while you were in them, versus now.
Yeah. So the first one in like 2010 through 2012, when you and I got together and we opened up our yoga studio, astrology, herb mecca, like little little melting pot. I remember, so I had been working at another yoga studio, and I was the director and the manager of their yoga studio. But I was getting a little bit disgruntled because I wanted to talk about spirituality. And I wanted to teach classes that were more infused with spiritual language. And the studio owner was really more like, well, this is a little bit more wellness, fitness, catering to that sort of audience. And so there was like a growing disrest and dis-ease inside of me. And so when Adam and I met and we had this idea and we opened up our studio, the thing is that I was afraid of, like, if I completely left the other, like, and it was like financial too, because I was making, I had a paycheck, right? And so when Adam and I opened it, I still was working there while I was trying to open and run my own studio. And it got to this point where I kept getting sick. Like, that was one thing. I don't know if you remember that. Like, you were like, gosh, you're getting sick all the time. Because I was, number one, just running myself ragged, trying to do two things. And I was afraid of letting go of my job at the old studio so that I could fully step into my work in the new studio. And I ended up having, the owner ended up sitting me down for a conversation saying, I think it's time for you to go. Like, I think and that was, it was heartbreaking because I had helped her open up the studio. I'd worked there for 5 years. I had grown all their programs, and I was attached to it. And I was also afraid. So it was like a forced moment where, I was told I was told to leave. I was like, I was not expecting that. I thought I could manage this unmanageable thing. And somehow, I don't know, I didn't know how I was going to get out of that pickle. I just knew I couldn't. I just knew I was stuck. And so that was a pivotal moment. And once I was let go of the old studio and I was forced, I had to take that step and be like, okay, well, this is all I've got now. And I have to be fully committed. And now I've got all my resources, like my inner resources, to really make it happen. And then it started really building. It was like after that chapter was closed and taken away, then the revenue, then everything started kind of flowing and building in the new space.
Yeah, that was Uranus in Aries, moving into your 10th house and conjoining your natal Venus during that period. And there was, this whole thing about the fear of moving out on your own. And then this sudden development where we met, launched the studio, you had to leave the other place. And, I remember you at times, the way you would describe it would be like, it feels like everything is falling apart, and you kept getting sick too. But then my memory, at least, is when you started owning it and being like, okay, wow, this is all happening in a sense to clarify and show me things that I need to see. And then there's this choice I need to, like a risk I need to step out and take in response to what's happening. And once you hit that part, then I don't think since then you would have described that any longer as like it was, you were just getting your ass tower carded.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, in the moment, it felt like the rug had been pulled out from underneath me, but looking back on it, I'm like, that was a cosmic gift,
Yeah.
like getting that little swat in the butt, like, nope, out the door, go on and do what you're here to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah. And also, though, I did have to take a hard look, though, at, my own selfishness too. Like, my selfishness kept me from not being 100% honest with
Hmm.
the woman that I was working with. And, I
That
was
you were interested in doing something of your own and you weren't quite telling her that
wasn't quite
yet. And
telling her exactly what
yeah.
I was doing. There was a little, like I just, because I was afraid. And so I was just trying to like keep my cards hidden. And after that happened, I was like, you know what? Like, that's not who I am. Like, this is also happening because I need to be more honest.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a really profound moment. Um, I think that if I look at it, for example, and the illumination slash individuation, um, for me, Uranus was trining my moon in Capricorn in the ninth house from my first house when I started realizing that um, I started having this recognition that I was not, the religious tradition that I was a part of was no longer a good fit. And same thing. It felt like there's a part of it, although I had other Uranus transits. So by this time I kind of knew, okay, this is familiar. This process is familiar, but it was illuminating and it was hard to look at.
Mm.
And it was the way that it was happening was pretty rapid and like, whew, like, oh, this is hard. And taking that big step of leaving and retaining my own name, it's very first house, that was hard, man. That was really tough. But I mean, and I look at it in hindsight as I have other Uranus transits and I go, that was like a big spotlight going up and being like, look at this and then go in that direction, I can't describe that any longer. I don't feel like Uranus is now my friend. It's a powerful friend. I'm not saying that like I'm on the level with Uranus, like I'm not that powerful. You know what I mean? Like it's an archetype, but I can't think of it now as like a destroyer of structures just for the hell of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the second thing that Uranus does and is awakens. So where there has been, let's call it boredom, or where there's been monotony, or where we've gotten stuck in a pattern or a rut, or where there's been unconscious material that has stagnated, Uranus will come along and deliver, again, often kind of sudden and unexpected and often very interesting and kind of bizarre and exciting things that will serve to awaken. Now, on the outset of that, you could describe it as shocking, sudden difficulties like that. But I would say that similarly, when there's something that's awakening us and drawing our attention to things that we've been stuck in or that haven't been working or whatever, the experience is one of feeling like you're coming to life again.
Mm.
Although initially the things that deliver the message that, hey, you're asleep or you're stuck we may describe them as shocking or like difficult and unexpected or something like that. Well, maybe you could reflect on this one for us.
Yeah. Can I jump to my 2018 to 20 experiences?
You are as free as Uranus to do whatever you want.
I can move about the cabin. All right. So, I mean, when I think about awakening and kind of having like that flash of insight and not being able to be the person you were, I think about some of the family karma that was really illuminated when Uranus transited my sun and moon. And was it opposing, or no, it was
It's conjoining.
conjoined. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
conjoining. So one of the incidents that happened was that my father had a really bad fall. And, this is not, this is something that I've shared publicly on my own channel, but, I grew up in a family where there was alcoholism, and, so, but we never talked about it. It was like, it was like this dirty secret. Nobody talked about it. We kind of like kept quiet. We pretended like everything was normal and we were like the ideal suburban family. And so I kind of had thought we were okay. Like I thought my family was normal. I actually kind of thought we were like even better than normal. And then when my dad blacked out one night and fell down the stairs and was rushed to shock trauma, where he had to stay for almost 3 weeks with a traumatic brain injury, it all started kind of crashing and falling apart. I mean, number one, I thought he was going to die. He had bleeding all over his brain. We didn't know if he was going to walk again. It was really scary. And after that, as he started going through rehabilitation, he had to learn how to walk again and do all, dress himself. At the end of that, I thought, because it's like, I feel like with Uranus transits, you're like, okay, this was shocking, but this is the breakthrough we need for this outcome that I have in my head. And so, you would think this is a rock bottom, right? Like he's going to wake up, he's going to be like, I need help. I'm, like, I need to change. I'm sorry. But that's not what happened. What ended up happening was he woke up and said, oops, I fell, but everything's fine. It was just a little mistake, a
I wasn't even
misstep.
drinking that much, like that
Wasn't
kind of thing.
drinking that much, where his blood alcohol was so far over the limit. The doctors were surprised he was even able to be walking, so it, basically when I gave an ultimatum, I would never thought he would have said, well, that's your choice. I hope you have a good life. And at that moment, it was like my world shattered. And I was like, who
Mm.
is this man? Who is this? What is this family? How has this disease gone so far? And I didn't even realize that the denial was so deep, and that, and then after that, my parents got divorced, which I didn't see coming. I didn't think that was going to happen either. And now my dad and I are estranged. I can't have a relationship with him. And while that was, I mean, excruciatingly painful and very, very hard, all of that, it was also awakening and illumined, like for me, the reality of something that I had been so, denying for so long. And I know for you, babe, like, you were, as an outsider, you were like, oh, there's something going on here. And I was like, nah, we're fine.
I mean, I think it's easier when you're objective and outsides, and I definitely didn't stand in judgment of anyone, but it was like, yeah, it was, it's like you can, it was like really kind of, in a way, it was like my first experience of seeing the disease of alcoholism at work in a really vivid way, and actually helped me understand some of what I experienced with my own father, who grew up as basically, like, what do they
Adult child of an alcoholic.
adult child of an alcoholic, because his father was a really nasty, mean drunk for a long time in his life. So anyway, drunk isn't a nice thing. I don't think that's the correct word anymore. Sorry. It's alcoholic. So anyway, that used to be the old way of that my dad would put it. So that's just in my head. But at any rate, the sudden shocking nature was there, right? But in hindsight, the way that you've described it in your YouTube channel, when you talk about Al-Anon, or when you talk about 12-step programs and rehabilitation, and the choices that you've had to make, and you've helped a lot of people who have really appreciated hearing from you, and in your own sort of recovery from the disease of alcoholism. The thing that's interesting is that although we would describe certain elements of that as shocking, traumatic, sudden, unexpected, and certainly difficult, one of the things that they did was, I mean, not to say whatever people do is their own business, but it certainly seemed to awaken something between your mom and dad. And it seems
Yeah.
to be that your mom feels that she's in a healthier place now. And I mean, my parents went through a divorce as well. And, I feel like, sometimes there's certain things that happen that awaken and then get you out of a rut. That's the point I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to condemn anyone or judge anyone, but that's the point. And then the other thing is, you started attending a 12-step program. And although I'd always experienced you as like, spiritually on your shit, like you've always cared about becoming a better person, learning from your experiences, being reflective. You've always been a humble, kind soul and compassionate and so forth. But this was like another level this was the biggest leap I had seen you take in terms of suddenly like the lights are on and I'm awake and I can't unsee things. And now I need to deal with certain things that have been stuck. And Uranus is so great at getting things unstuck through this kind of like awakening and illuminating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, yeah, like suddenly it was like all of the patterns and these coping mechanisms that had served me for a long time, like being very controlling, being controlled, holding it together, really trying to achieve and be a perfectionist and please people, and all of these things that I thought were me. I ended up starting to realize, oh no, these were coping strategies for living in a very, disordered family. And these were ways that I tried to make sense of what was going on and trying to control. And that's something, that I think it happens in a lot of families where there's addiction, is that the children can, one of them, usually the oldest often, will just become like a hyper controlling type. Um, to try to keep things organized. And as soon as that started unraveling, gosh, I started having fun. I was like, it doesn't have to be so serious, And I was like, I just started making different choices because I started realizing that the weight of the world didn't have to be mine to carry anymore. And that I was also, like I could have fun and be free and enjoy things in a way that I never given myself permission to, because I was scared if I did, that everything around me would fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as I started kind of placing my trust in a higher power, like for reals, like not just like the yoga, like trust in a higher power, but like actually letting things like unburdening and saying, here, God, please take this,
Yeah.
and living in that way. Suddenly it was like suddenly I could see more of who I actually was underneath all of those things I carried.
So in other words, you wouldn't describe the encounter with Uranus as tower carding your ass and shocking and traumatizing you with unexpected difficulties just to fuck around with you.
No, no. I mean, yeah. I mean, at the moment, it's like, you feel like you're beneath crumble. Like it's like the crumbled mortar is like, you're surrounded by it. But then once you stand up and you're like, thanks, dude. Like you just cleared a wall out. That was really
Yeah.
helpful.
I want to make it clear that I don't think the planets, I said this earlier too. It's like, I don't think the planets are like an old man with a belt being like, this is good for you. I hate having to do this. That's not
Yeah.
what's happening. The planets literally are like respecting the choices we've made, the things that we've built with our free will. And they are moving the story along according to the logic and psychic intricacies of
Mhm.
our own choices and our own lives. And I think that they deeply respect what we've built and they don't condemn it or judge it, but they keep us growing and moving and deepening. And I think the one thing the planets do is they say, there's more love, there's more life, there's more soul, there's more heart. Trust me, and let's keep going. And in that way, I feel like it's not about them trying to make us get something right. They're
Mhm.
not doing this to be punitive and like, adjust us into the appropriate posture or something. What they're really in my experience anyway, is that what they're doing is they are continuing to guide us, deepen us, make us wiser and more illumined. I know that this is probably going to sound really far out, right? But I remember in ayahuasca ceremonies, one of the things that I really perceived was that there are beings around us, plants in particular, and I know you'll resonate with this, that are so wise. And that wisdom, I believe, comes through just souls continuing to experience and grow and learn, and not in a get something right kind of way, but just in a, this is what life is. And the more you keep going, the more that who you are becomes medicinal and healing and illuminating for others as well. I really do believe that when the Taoists talk about a light body, that's a real thing. That when we think, well, when I see these spirits of plants in ayahuasca ceremonies that are literally talking to me, and they're so wise and compassionate and healing, that they're also like plucking thorns out of me that hurt. That kind of wisdom comes through these kinds of experiences over time, and that they develop within us some sensitivities and some ways of seeing and experiencing things that we can't grow without. But I just want to make sure that people don't hear us saying that, like, this is good for you, bend over and take it, on the
Right.
butt. I'm going to give you a whipping or something. Like, that's not what's going on here, Anyway, the final thing that I think Uranus does, which we've been alluding to all along, is it liberates. This is very similar to awakening, slightly different in that it creates space where there was constriction. So when Ashley was talking about control, I was thinking, that leads into point number 3 really nicely, because where there is control, often there's not an allowance of like a flow creatively. And where there's flow creatively, the soul gets happy. I was just thinking about, I'm not the world's biggest dog person. I actually mentioned not long before we got Hilda that I'd never really had like a heart companion of an animal. I've had animals my whole life, but never really one that felt like a heart companion. She feels like that for me. One of the things that I've noticed, but animal owners are going to be like, this is so basic, but for me, it's really profound, which is that if I don't try to control her too much, which I want her to learn the rules of the house and everything, but it's, if I just talk to her, right? If I just kind of show affection, a lot of positivity and warmth, and if I actually communicate with her, that all of a sudden she and I have a bond where it's like, I can trust her. I don't need to control her because I can just trust her. So much of what Uranus does is it just opens up space in our life. And it says you don't have to control everything. And you can just trust that this openness everything will fall into place. Everything will get done. There's time enough for everything. There's space enough for everything. And you don't have to figure out how it will get done. It just will. And it's just, to me, the equivalent insight that I've been having right now has been with this this moose puppy, where it's like, just forge, just create space and intimacy and love and a kind of creative connection with this living being, and all of a sudden everything just takes care of itself. And I think that that's something that is true for all of us. Like, that's what a Uranus transit brings somehow. It's just spaciousness and create, almost like a creative trust.
Yeah, and I feel like it's really closely connected to what we fear. I think in a lot of ways, what Uranus can do is it can like really show us what we're afraid of. Like, oh, you're afraid of losing your family. Well, let's look at that. Or you're really afraid. Like, we decided to close our yoga studio in 2019 during the Uranus conjunction with my sun and moon, and I was afraid. Who am I? What am I going to do if I don't have a yoga studio, herb school? And so what ended up happening through facing all of those fears was a liberation, was like, what, there's so much more than those things. And when those things are taken away, you realize that you actually have a lot more resources than you realized, because now we've taken, there's been something taken off your plate, and that can be psychically or it can be actually physically. And, I think there's just something, something really refreshing when when you come through it, like when you come through that experience and suddenly, yeah, there's so much more. I love the word spaciousness that you used, because you're free, you're
Mhm.
not the fears that you had, you're no longer tethered to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll remember the experience for me most recently with Uranus squaring my natal Venus in Leo, which is my ascendant ruler. And one of the things that had happened was, our bedtime routines with the kids over time had sort of cut into the space that Ashley and I were used to. And I've told you guys this story a few times on my channel, but basically, as Uranus was hitting my Venus, I realized that, well, there had been like certain underlying fears and resentments around like it's like I think a lot of men deal with this, where it's like, oh, my wife is more connected to the kids than we used to be, connected to each other. And you can start to feel threatened by that, and it can create all sorts of like subtle ways in which you start to distance yourself from someone. And I don't like Ashley and I didn't feel distant. Like I didn't feel distant from you. But then this transit came, and suddenly I started realizing some of these distancing things, subtle and um, little resentments and stuff. And all of a sudden it was like Uranus was just like, take two big steps forward toward your wife. And all of a sudden, and I realized suddenly, I was like, well, there's no reason we can't get back to the patterns that we had before the kids were born, because the space allows for it now. But the reason I'm not doing it is because I developed some ways of protecting myself from
Mhm.
the kids having a lot more of our time and energy, and that it hurt. And I was, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
then it was like, I took these big steps forward toward you. I was like, let's do our routines together, blah, blah, blah. And then you were like, yeah, like
Totally.
it
Yeah.
was,
It was a really cool kind of like fireworks, I think, moment where I think both of us had developed, again, it's like coping mechanisms. It's like, okay, there were stresses. And so we found ways to manage them that were very controlled and they became
yes,
habits. And then all of a sudden, it was like, oh, wait a second, there is actually another path. And
yes,
that looks like way more fun. That looks actually
yeah,
like a way better option.
yeah, yeah,
And it
exactly.
wasn't hard. It wasn't hard to make those changes once you could see what the old ones were actually doing.
That's exactly right. And there's this weird way in which suddenly the spaciousness appears.
Hmm.
And I was like, I'm living with a constricted mode. I would call it pretty subtle. Like, I don't feel like we were like super far apart or anything, but
Hmm.
there was this kind of these subtle patterns of not being as close that had snuck in as ways of dealing with the pressure of kids. And all of a sudden, it was just crystal clear illumination away. It was like, you actually, now that the kids are a little bit older, you have time and space to do these things that you used to do. Why aren't you doing them? And I was like, oh yeah. And so all of a sudden, all this space got created for creative flow in our relationship again for the first time in some years, since since our second daughter was born. So it was like that process of the initial stage of looking at that for me was really hard, because I had to get really real about my own fears and stuck stuff. And you could describe that in the sudden way in which I became aware of those things as difficult. But in hindsight, where I am now, where we are now, I'm like, wow, there's so much more space. And so one of the things that I think if you stick with Uranus over the years, you come to trust where you'll end up with the planet, as opposed to maybe some of the process that can be more challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. There's something when you've been through it a few times where you start to see that there's a method to the madness.
Yeah.
Like, we're going somewhere and I just have to, and I think that's, we talked about spiritual bypassing, and I feel like one of the great gifts when you're wrestling Uranus is that you can't bypass. I mean, you
Mm-mm.
might try, but I think he's a stronger angel. So, in some ways, the harder you battle it, yeah, the less fun it can be, right?
That's right. Well, on that note, I don't want to buy it is date night for us, and I don't want to
It is,
bypass
I
date night.
know. Yep.
So
We
shall
got
we wrap
plans.
it up?
Yes.
So I want to point you guys to Ashley's work. You can find her on YouTube at Skyhouse Herbs, where Ashley makes weekly videos and regular content on herbal medicine and healing and recovering from trauma, and all sorts of really good work that she's done talking about addiction and recovery, and especially plant spirit medicine. So please check her out. She is the illumination that lives in my heart. So I know that you guys will also really enjoy her and her work. Instagram is Skyhouse Herbs, and you can also find her at skyhouseherbs.com. Is there anything that you want to promote or say anything about?
I guess the Roots and Spheres course, if folks don't know about it, I'm sure you talk about it a lot, but we are opening, we have registration open, right?
For
For
2024, that's right.
2024, where we co-teach and follow the transits through the lunar calendar and through each lunar cycle, and then we partner a plant with that cycle, and then as a community, we all get together and talk about what is our experience with that plant and all of the themes of those lunar transits. So that's been really fun, and then you're teaching in Toronto. Is that a public thing?
That's not until May. And it
Oh,
is public, but only for people, I guess, that are a part of like a local astrology group in Toronto. They might be able to buy admission to it online, but we are co-teaching at that event as well, where we'll be looking at the 12 houses and also at plant allies that can help remediate challenging planetary placements in each of the 12 houses. So that should be pretty cool.
yeah. That's all.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I hope
Let's
that
go date night.
I know it's date night. On that note, I hope that you guys really have been enjoying this series, and that going through these talks, even if you already know it, you've probably heard enough astrology to hear the more positive, uplifting takes on the planets, but it's easy to let underlying anxiety if you consume astrological content, it's likely that at least now and then you're going to hit some anxiety. And so I hope that this series, it sticks in your brain, so you can hear the jokes and the stories and the ways that we have of reframing the planets, so that you too can be wrestling with these angels and discovering their names. So we hope that for you. We wish that for you. And we thank you so much for watching, and we will see you again next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.